An old man sits on the dirt floor of a Roman holding cell, listening to the heavy scratching of a reed pen against parchment. The man who fell asleep during the darkest hour of his master's life is now desperately begging his readers to stay alert. Then, the mountain suddenly ignites. The darkness shatters completely. Light pours directly from the rabbi's skin. His clothing bleaches to a brilliant, terrifying white. Two ancient prophets step out of eternity and plant their feet in the dirt of first-century Palestine. You can hear the low, vibrating hum of their voices, speaking about the exodus Jesus is about to accomplish. And Peter? Peter is unconscious. He wakes up panicked. He babbles about building tents. He speaks because he does not know what to say, terrified by the glory he almost missed. It happens here on the Mountain of Transfiguration. It happens again months later in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus bleeds from his pores. The fate of the cosmos hangs in the balance. The air is thick with impending violence, and Peter sleeps in the dirt. When the veil pulls back, when the spiritual reality of the universe breaks violently into the physical world, the rock of the early church is catching his breath. His physical exhaustion is not just a bodily limit. It is the symptom of a mind disconnected from the spiritual war raging around him. Decades pass. The sleepy fisherman finally wakes up to the reality of the empire. He sits in a Roman holding cell, feeling the damp chill of a stone wall against his back. He knows what happens when you close your eyes on the front lines. The man who panicked and lied to a servant girl around a charcoal fire is now commanding a persecuted church. He knows the catastrophic cost of losing focus. He remembers waking up to the blinding light of glory. He remembers waking up to the bronze torches of the arresting soldiers. So, when he picks up his pen to write his second and final letter, his tone shifts entirely. He warns his readers about false teachers. He warns them about the creeping cynicism that says Jesus is never returning. He warns them that the enemy is prowling like a starving lion, looking for anyone who has dozed off on their watch. He does not ask his readers to find comfort. He does not ask them to find peace. He demands an intense, wide-awake urgency, and to snap them out of their slumber. He reaches for a specific Greek word that carries the frantic energy of a man running out of time. Open the heavy parchment of 2 Peter. Chapter 1. Verse 5. The author is acutely aware that his execution is imminent, explicitly stating just a few verses later that the folding up of his earthly tent is drawing near. He is leaving his final will and testament to a network of believers who are dangerously close to slipping into moral complacency, listening to false teachers who claim the return of Christ is a myth. And to combat this apathy, he issues a directive to stand firm in the face of imperial lions. He is writing the exact opposite of how he once lived, that English Bibles usually translate as, "Make every effort to add to your faith." The phrase hinges entirely on the Greek noun spoude. It appears 12 times in the New Testament, and its primary definition is not just a generalized, polite diligence. The root of spoude carries the literal meaning of speed, breathless haste, and intense, physical urgency. In the ancient Roman world, this was the exact vocabulary used to describe the pounding feet of a royal courier kicking up dust on a paved road, or the rapid, a frantic movement of a civilian fleeing a collapsing building. The word implies the sound of a heart beating fast in a chest. Look at how the Gospel of Mark uses the same root when the daughter of Herodias dances for the king and is promised whatever she wants. Mark records that she rushed back into the banquet hall with haste to demand the severed head of John the Baptist on a silver platter. That is spoude. It is a terrifying, laser-focused momentum that contains absolutely zero hesitation and zero delay. That root changes everything about how we read Peter's final command. When he tells the church to apply spoude to their faith, he is telling them to sprint toward godliness, like a courier delivering a wartime dispatch. He remembers the heavy gravity. Most people read the epistles of 1st and 2nd Peter as generic instruction manuals. They treat them like a collection that pulled his own eyelids shut on the Mount of Transfiguration. The freezing air that lulled him to sleep when he was supposed to be watching. He knows exactly how easy it is for a believer to stop paying attention. to let the muscles of their faith atrophy while the world around them burns. Spiritual endurance is not a passive state you eventually drift into. It is a deliberate, waking sprint against the gravity of your own fatigue. Peter is demanding that the church cultivate the exact vigilance that he lacked when Jesus was agonizing in the garden. He has finally realized that following the Messiah requires an aggressive, forward motion, entirely opposite to the spiritual lethargy that defined his worst moments. He learned to put the sword back in its sheath, and he learned to keep his eyes wide open in the dark. But there is one more ghost Peter has to deal with before the Romans come for him. The fog sits low on the Sea of Tiberias. The water laps against the wooden hull of a fishing boat. A man jumps into the freezing surf, his heavy outer garment wrapped around his waist, wading desperately through the shoreline waves. He is running toward a charcoal fire. The last time Peter stood near a charcoal fire, he was shivering in a high priest's courtyard of early Christian behavioral codes, a list of rules for how to be a good citizen, swearing a bitter curse that he did not know Jesus of Nazareth. The smell of the burning wood in the dawn air is the smell of his own treason. It is the scent of the exact moment his courage broke and his loyalty collapsed. But this fire is different. The resurrected rabbi is cooking breakfast on the glowing coals. Jesus hands the freezing fisherman warm bread. He hands him roasted fish. And then, over the crackle of the flames, he begins the agonizing, beautiful work of dismantling the fisherman's shame. Jesus does not ask for a strategic plan. Jesus does not demand a blood penance. Jesus does not review the footage of the courtyard betrayal. He asks a single question, repeated 3 times, perfectly matching the 3 frantic denials that still echo in Peter's skull. Do you love me? And with every tear-soaked affirmation, Jesus issues a command that will redefine the rest of Peter's existence. Feed my sheep. The restoration is not a private absolution. It is a public commissioning. Jesus takes the man who just proved he could not even protect his own integrity, and he hands him the care of an entire flock. He takes the loudest, most aggressive, most fragile, ego, in the upper room, and he commands him to become a shepherd. Fast forward 30 years. The shepherd sits in the gloom, a good spouse, a good martyr in a hostile world. But when you place the specific vocabulary of these letters, of a Roman holding cell, dictating the 5th chapter of his first epistle, he addresses the leaders of the scattered, terrified house churches across the empire. He does not call himself their supreme commander. He calls himself a fellow elder, and he writes, "Shepherd the flock of God that is among you," not under compulsion, but willingly, because he remembers swinging an iron sword in a garden to force an outcome, not domineering over those in your charge, but being examples, because he remembers arguing about who was the greatest, right before he abandoned his master to die alone. Peter is taking the charcoal fire from the beach and lighting it in the center of every persecuted church in Asia Minor. He is taking the unmerited grace that rebuilt his own shattered soul and institutionalizing it for the survival of the believers. He was broken so that he could learn how to gently bind up the wounds of the empire's victims. But the power of Peter's letters is not just that they document his own historical transformation. The true weight of these epistles hits you when you realize that his failure was never just about him. We are a species completely obsessed with hiding our own fractures. When a modern leader experiences a catastrophic moral collapse, directly next to the chronological life of the man who wrote them, the text shatters that assumption entirely. The instinct is to bury the evidence, to rebrand the image, to sweep the ashes of the failure under a heavy rug of public relations. We curate our public profiles to project unshakable competence, terrified that if anyone actually saw the panicked, reactionary decisions we make in the dark, we would be immediately exiled. We assume that spiritual authority requires a flawless resume. We believe that once the porcelain of our integrity shatters, the pieces are entirely useless to the kingdom of heaven. But the ink drying on the parchment of Peter's letters establishes a completely different architecture. When you read 1st and 2nd Peter, you are reading a theology of failure. You are reading the words of a man who knows exactly what it feels like to have the cold sweat of a lie break out on his forehead. A man who knows the bitter, metallic taste of his own cowardice. He does not hide the fact that he fell asleep in the freezing air of the garden. He does not obscure the reality that he swung a heavy iron sword in a panicked rage. He does not edit out the charcoal fire. He leverages every single one of those humiliating memories to teach a persecuted church how to survive a Roman onslaught. These letters are not a theological textbook. They are an autopsy of his own failures. Peter is taking the worst moments. The grace of God is not an eraser. It is a forge that weaponizes your humiliation for the survival of someone else. When Peter tells the believers to stay sober and alert, the command carries the crushing weight of a man who almost lost his soul because he closed his eyes. When he tells them to endure suffering without striking back, the instruction is soaked in the blood of the high priest's servant. The instruction is credible precisely because the messenger is broken. Jesus did not choose a stoic philosopher to lead the church through its first wave of imperial terror. He did not choose a man with an impeccable record of emotional regulation. He chose a fisherman who routinely let his anxiety hijack his hands. This is the divine alchemy of the early church. The very things that should have permanently disqualified Simon Peter from leadership are the exact materials Jesus used to construct the pastoral foundation of the epistles. Jesus allowed Peter to experience the total collapse of his own ego, his own strength, and his own violent theology, so that decades later, a scattered network of terrified Christians could read a letter from a man who actually understood their panic. He is the patron saint of the shattered ego of his life, the catastrophic mistakes that should have disqualified him forever, and reverse engineering them into a map for the early church. And when you pull back to look at the entire scope of his life, from the fishing boats of Galilee to the damp floors of a Roman prison, you begin to see the shape of a magnificent, completed pattern. He swung an iron sword in an olive grove and wrote the blueprint for peaceful submission. He fell asleep on a freezing mountain and commanded a persecuted church to stay breathlessly awake. He panicked in the presence of a servant girl and prepared a generation to face down the Roman emperor. He fought his friends for supremacy in the upper room and laid down the rules for humble, gentle leadership. He denied his master around a charcoal fire and taught terrified believers how to stand firm in the flames. He tried to violently alter the redemption of the world and ended up yielding completely to the chains of an unjust empire. He shattered his own integrity in the dark and became the shepherd who guided the early church into the dawn. One broken fisherman, one unshakable foundation. But maybe the part that stays with me most is the sound of that reed pen. He is not preaching from a pedestal of perfection. He is handing a terrified people the antidote to the exact poisons he once drank himself, scratching on the parchment in the Roman cell. The man dictating those letters is not the loud, brash disciple who thought he could save the world with his own two hands. He is bruised. He is subdued. He is a man who learned the agonizing difference between his own panicked strength and the quiet, tactical deployment of heavenly authority. If you are in a season where your own failures feel final, if you have swung the sword of your own anxiety, or fallen asleep on your watch, or sat by a fire and denied the very things you swore you would protect, do not assume the story is over. Your collapse is not your disqualification. It is your curriculum. The kingdom of heaven does not require a pristine, unbroken record. It requires your absolute surrender to the shepherd who meets you on the beach, hands you warm bread, and points you right back to the flock. And may the God who has never once wasted a catastrophe walk with you through the ashes of yours and bring you out carrying a strength you could not have received any other way. The air in the room is thick with the smell of damp stone and impending execution. This changes how you read every command he issues. And it matters because it answers a question that quietly haunts almost everyone who tries to walk out their faith. What actually happens after you ruin everything? When your courage breaks, when you react in anger, when you deny the very thing you swore to protect what is left of you. Jesus did not just forgive Peter. He weaponized Peter's failures for the survival of the church. To find the pulse of this transformation, you have to look past the English translations we are so used to reading. You have to look at the specific Greek vocabulary this old man chooses to employ. Words that carry the ghost of a sword and the memory of a sleepy watchman. To understand the letters, you have to start in a garden of olive trees, where a frightened fisherman decided to pull a blade on the Roman Empire. Read the Gospels. Read the letters. The collision is violent. In the historical accounts, Peter is a storm of reaction. He speaks before he thinks. He moves before he sees. He swings a heavy iron blade at a high priest's servant. He sinks into the freezing salt water of the Sea of Galilee. He is dictating a letter to a scribe named Silvanus, pacing the narrow space with a heavy, uneven step. He pulls Jesus aside to rebuke him. He falls asleep when he is supposed to be standing guard. He sits by a charcoal fire, shivering in the cold, and swears a bitter curse to a servant girl, denying he even knows the man facing execution. That is the gospel man. Loud, brash, dominated by a desperate need for control. Now look at the letters. The man dictating these epistles is a completely different species of human. He writes with a slow, deliberate gravity. He tells a persecuted church to embrace the very suffering he once told Jesus to avoid. He commands his readers to prepare their minds for action, to stay sober, to remain perfectly calm in the face of imperial terror. He demands submission. He commands humility. He preaches an unshakable, quiet endurance. The epistles are not a polite theological update. They are the scars of a subdued ego. You are watching an aggressive, reactionary brawler, actively dismantling the architecture of his own youth. Every command in 1st and 2nd Peter can be traced backward to a specific, catastrophic failure in Peter's past. He is taking the broken pieces of his own story and forging them into a shield for a terrified church. The hands tucked into his rough woolen cloak are thick and calloused, the hands of a Galilean fisherman, permanently scarred by salt and hemp rope. When he tells believers to endure unjust beatings without retaliation, this is the man who once drew a sword because he felt threatened. When he tells church elders not to domineer but to serve, this is the man who constantly argued with his friends over who was the greatest. When he tells them to resist the roaring lion, he remembers the exact moment his own courage evaporated in the courtyard. He is not handing down abstract religious platitudes. He is handing down survival tactics he learned by almost destroying himself. This completely reframes the nature of biblical authority. The instruction in these letters is not a sterile moral code dropped from the sky. It is forged in the brutal humiliation of a real human being. Peter's authority to lead does not come from a record of perfection. It comes from the depth of his restoration. But to feel the true impact of this shift, you cannot just look at the broad strokes of his life. You have to zoom in. You have to look at the microscopic level of his vocabulary. You have to trace a single Greek word from the Roman parchment back to the worst night he ever lived. Because there is a detail hiding in the text of 1 Peter, and to see it, you have to stand the darkness of an olive grove. Listen to the clash of iron, and watch the exact moment his worldview shattered. He is not writing a political manifesto. He is writing a survival guide to a network of believers scattered across Asia Minor. The air in the Garden of Gethsemane is heavy with the smell of crushed olives and the sweat of exhausted men. Torches suddenly pierce the darkness, casting long, violent shadows across the ancient trees as a battalion of soldiers marches into the grove. The night is instantly vibrating with the clatter of bronze armor and the harsh shouting of armed men coming to arrest a rabbi. Jesus steps forward to meet them, offering himself to the mob, surrendering his freedom without a trace of resistance. And in that fractured, terrifying second, Peter makes a choice that makes perfect sense to his worldview. He reaches beneath his heavy cloak, wraps his rough fingers around the cold iron hilt of a short sword, and swings it toward the head of the high priest's servant. The blade connects, slicing cleanly through flesh and cartilage, sending hot blood splashing onto the dry soil. The violence in the garden is not a display of loyalty. It is the symptom of a completely shattered theology. Peter deeply believes that the Messiah must conquer by force. That physical power must be met with physical power. that the only way to survive a mortal threat is to violently dominate it. But Jesus turns to him in the flickering torchlight and destroys that entire paradigm with a single, devastating command. People who are waking up to find the empire suddenly turning against them. You can hear the urgency in the ink. Put your sword back into its sheath. Jesus reaches out to heal the bleeding servant. He willingly submits to the heavy chains of his captors. He allows himself to be dragged away into the darkness, deliberately yielding to the corrupt, unjust authorities of the Roman and Jewish elite. Jesus is showing his most aggressive disciple that true divine authority does not need to assert itself with violence, because it is already perfectly secure. Peter is left standing alone in the olive grove, staring at a blood-stained blade, his entire belief system unraveling into the dirt. He thought he was defending the king of the universe, but he was actually trying to stop the atonement of the world. It takes a lifetime for the shock of that moment to fully reshape a human soul. The instinct for self-preservation runs deep, and the desire to fight back when threatened is the most natural human reflex on earth. Peter had to be broken of that reflex entirely. He had to learn, through his own agonizing failure, that the kingdom of heaven does not advance by striking down its enemies, but by absorbing their blows. Decades later, the man who swung that sword sits in a Roman prison, dictating a letter to a church facing an empire far more dangerous than a midnight mob. And when he tells them how to survive, he reaches for a specific Greek word that proves the ghost of Gethsemane never left him. But if you listen closely to the cadence of his sentences, you start to hear a secondary echo. Open the heavy pages of 1 Peter, chapter 2, verse 13. We read these words today sitting in comfortable rooms, often skimming right past the sheer gravity of what is being demanded on the parchment. The author is writing to a network of believers who are watching their world catch fire. They are facing economic boycotts, physical violence, and the creeping shadow of imperial persecution. And his instruction to them is staggering. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority. The word our English translations use for submit is the Greek hupotasso. It is a heavily loaded military term. It comes from the prefix hupo, meaning under, and the root tasso, meaning to arrange in an orderly fashion. In the 1st century Roman world, it was the exact word used to describe troops voluntarily falling into rank beneath their commanding officer, a deliberate, tactical positioning on a battlefield. In the ancient mindset, hupotasso was not about being weak or voiceless. A soldier who falls into rank is not surrendering his strength. He is bringing his strength under the control of a higher command. When Peter swung the sword, his strength was completely unregulated. He was a chaotic force, operating entirely on his own panicked reflexes. The man dictating this letter is practically unrecognizable from the man we meet in the 4 Gospels. If seeing the raw, human history behind these biblical commands is shifting how you read the text, you're exactly who this channel is for. Drop a thought in the comments and hit subscribe. Because every week, we go deeper into the text than you knew was possible. So, the old fisherman dictates this military command to his scribe. He tells his readers to hupotasso to the emperor, to the local governors, to the very institutions that are currently grinding their communities into the dirt. He is asking them to voluntarily arrange themselves under the crushing weight of an unjust system. When you remember the blood soaking into the dirt in Gethsemane, this root word changes everything. Peter is writing to terrified people who instinctively want to fight back. People who want to draw a blade and defend their rights in the dark. Exactly like he once did. He knows the intoxicating rush of righteous anger. He knows the desperate urge to strike the servant of the high priest to protect what he loves. But he is telling the church to sheath their weapons and deliberately yield to the authorities. The disciple, who was defined by his impulsive rage, is now writing long paragraphs about quiet endurance, because he finally understands what Jesus was doing when he surrendered to the torches. Biblical submission is not a posture of weakness. It is the tactical deployment of heavenly authority. Jesus did not lose the battle in the garden by submitting to the chains. He won the war by refusing to fight on the empire's terms. trusting that his Father was orchestrating the resurrection on the other side of the arrest. And Peter, the man who once tried to hack his way out of a crisis, is now passing that exact strategy down to the next generation of believers. He learned how to put the sword away, but the instinct for violence was not the only thing Peter had to unlearn in the shadows. The air is thin. The climb is brutal. The three fishermen collapse on the high ridge of Mount Hermon. Their muscles burn from the elevation. Their eyelids drag. The night air settles freezing cold against their sweat-soaked skin. Jesus walks a few paces away in the dark. He begins to pray. The fishermen are supposed to watch. They are supposed to stand guard. But they drift. The fatigue wins. The heavy fog of sleep pulls them under.